Good morning, everyone. Thanks for showing up. Some of us quite early, others a little bit in the afternoon, depending upon where you're logging in from. My name is Joe Slowick, and we're going to be talking about Spyware Stealer LockerWiper, a little play off of Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, revisiting LockerGoga and specifically the Norsk incident from almost exactly a year ago today, or yesterday, really. So the origins of why we're doing this as a webinar is that originally this was supposed to be a presentation at the Troopers Conference. One of my favorite events. It's held in Heidelberg, Germany every spring. Was privileged to be a part of that event, or was supposed to be a part of that event this year. And then unfortunately, because as we all know, things are getting a little interesting out there, to say the least, the event was canceled almost the last minute. But instead of just letting work sort of die or not be presented or whatever, I figured like, well, I already have this set up. Why not just do this as a webinar? So here we are this morning. So thank you for joining me as we try to make the best of a interesting situation. So first, who am I? My name is Joe Slowick. I do industrial control system focused threat intelligence for Dragos. I like to make fun of myself as well, hence this interesting picture. But in addition to working for Dragos, well, prior to working for Dragos, I did incident response work for the U.S. Department of Energy at Los Alamos National Labs, and was a information warfare officer in the U.S. Navy. Now I'm hunting adversaries targeting critical infrastructure and specifically industrial control system environments. But enough of that and enough introductory work. Let's go over what we'll talk about today or this morning for some of us. So our agenda is, first we'll go over ransomware just at a high level, just to make sure that we're all relatively on the same page with things. Then go into LockerGoga specifically, and then how the Norsk incident represented a somewhat interesting variant of ransomware activity based on some curious aspects of the specific samples involved or likely involved in that event. And then based on that, we'll talk about how ransomware can be used or might be repurposed as a wiper and provide sort of a fig leaf or cover for more disruptive operations as opposed to just monetization. So ransomware defined, we'll go to the Oxford English Dictionary here, is malicious software designed to block access to a computer system until a sum of money is paid. Seems pretty straightforward. It's a extortionate sort of activity. It's one of the most lucrative behind business email compromise, which I think gets overlooked quite a bit. But in addition to generating funds, it's also disruptive because when files are locked, you obviously can't do anything with them. And we're certainly familiar with a number of high-profile incidents, whether it's impacting local governments or businesses or other entities where ransomware has significantly disrupted or crippled operations, resulting in expensive recovery efforts. What's interesting about ransomware, though, is that it's really older than you think. The first real example of a ransomware or ransomware-like malware goes all the way back to 1989 from a piece of software distributed by floppy disk, for those of you who remember what those are, to researchers at an AIDS conference, which, we're talking now amidst the novel coronavirus pandemic of how we want ransomware authors to leave hospitals alone. We're considering that the first ransomware type was something targeting healthcare researchers working on that generation or that era's largest concern. We can look as ransomware as having always had kind of an asshole-ish like intent, excuse my language, but there's really no better description for how these people operate. But after 1989, we certainly didn't see a whole lot until then. Right around like the 2013 timeframe, we start seeing CryptoLocker and other sorts of items coming, and then things just blow up from there. This chart from F-Secure does a really good job, even if it's not the easiest thing to read, that we've seen just an incredible profusion of ransomware variants, especially in the last couple of years. And what really it goes to show is that there's no point in developing or deploying this sort of stuff if you're not actually being successful to some degree. So it certainly seems, at least given the marketplace of ransomware variants out there, that this has become somewhat successful business for malicious actors out there. One thing that's been interesting, though, over time is that ransomware, as far as its behavior and deployment, has not been static. And we've seen, again, these are generalizations, so there are certainly counterexamples to all of these. But broadly speaking, we've seen some major shifts in behavior over time. So prior to 2017, primarily seeing targeting via phishing or exploit kits on websites with a real focus on single victim, single machine sort of impacts. So in these sorts of scenarios, you're talking about sort of onesie twosies and for a Bitcoin or two or whatever, unlocking files. Then things got really interesting in 2017 with the rise of the worms. So WannaCry being the most obvious and most noteworthy example, where using the MS-1710 vulnerability, SMBV1 vulnerability, we're able to still target single machines, but spread across entire networks quite rapidly in order to encrypt quite large swaths of victim space roughly simultaneously, which was quite concerning. But then, while I expected worms to try to last a bit longer, especially as we started seeing some dynamic credential capture, vulnerable malware using things like Mimikatz in order to start spreading within networks through that mechanism. Instead, what we've seen from 2018 to the present is a shift, at least by certain variants, towards sort of big game hunting ransomware activity where interactive on-keyboard operations by a malicious actor is used to break into a corporate network, usually compromise Active Directory or a significant number of credentials, and then using either those captured credentials, scripts, or Active Directory compromise, hold the entire network hostage and then negotiate for a sort of bulk decryption. So holding entire organizations' feet to the fire in order to maximize payouts. So as part of that development, LockerGoga emerged in early 2018 as one of these sort of big game hunting style ransomware variants. It lacked a self-propagating mechanism, which again had been a sort of a big deal with how things functioned previously, and other than that, fairly standard functionality. So it first came to light with an attack on a French engineering company called Altron. That event was certainly very disruptive, but at the same time, aside from a shift to sort of an industrial entity, which was somewhat new for how ransomware behaved, otherwise, the sort of things that we were observing with LockerGoga really didn't differentiate it that significantly from other sorts of ransomware. So its overall behavior, focus on entire network extortion and negotiation and deployed via a coordinated whole of network compromise. The French search put out some excellent reporting covering likely events, including Altron, for how a combination of tools like Cobalt Strike, Mimikatz, interpreter, etc., all sort of used in conjunction to compromise the network and then leveraging that access in order to disseminate the malware throughout the network. What was interesting about LockerGoga is that it did function a little bit differently than other ransomware variants in that it relied on a single parent process spawning multiple per file child processes in order to encrypt files, so it produces a fair amount of overhead, and it utilized some open C++ libraries, Boost and Crypto++ for functionality, which was also a little different from things that were being observed in other variants. As far as sequencing is concerned, so fairly straightforward here. Malware would execute, delete the original file, then launch child processes to encrypt the files, as I just mentioned, and then the ransom note is dropped to desktop after encryption is completed. So, again, fairly standard activity. So I mentioned that the French CERT put out a rather good report, if you can speak French, that covers a lot of the behavior for LockerGoga, as well as some contemporaneous events with the Ryuk ransomware that really emphasized initial access via external service compromise and brute forcing remote access mechanisms. So again, especially in this era of increased work from home, remote work because of the virus, make sure you're patching your external services and using multi-factor authentication, and then using a combination of things like Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire, PSExec to move laterally throughout the environment, and finally distributing malware through scripts and batch files, leveraging the credentials captured during the intrusion and remotely executing via PSExec. So nothing here that's earth-shattering, things that you would expect any good pen tester in order to do in order to breach an environment during an engagement. Nothing like any sort of custom malware or techniques, but really a reliance on public, semi-commercial, and open source tooling in order to facilitate the intrusion. So ultimately, while it was interesting looking at the targeting, focusing on an industrial enterprise, ultimately LockerGoga, on first glance, it was more ransomware. Meh, not a big deal. Well, then something very interesting happened, again, like almost exactly a year ago on 18 March of 2019, when Norsk, a very large manufacturer and aluminum producer, was hit with a crippling cyber attack, a ransomware incident that was ultimately linked back to a LockerGoga. Kevin Beaumont wrote a really good article that put together a lot of the initial information that was available at the time to go over what happened in that environment. But looking at it, the event was quite interesting. I imagine showing up to work and seeing these sorts of notes stuck to the window, so to speak, where do not turn on any device on the network. And it was that sort of aspect which was very interesting about this, that indicated something different was going on here. So whereas we saw with the Altron incident that PSExec and other items in order to distribute malware throughout the network, with Hydro, events worked out a little bit differently. And Kevin noted this in his article, that instead it seemed that the malware was distributed through compromise of the Active Directory incidents at Norsk, which also seems to be the case looking at public statements coming from Hydro itself and some indications that Microsoft may have been involved in rebuilding their instance, that they essentially had to burn the network to the ground and rebuild it. But also it appeared that devices were being compromised as soon as they authenticated onto the network, which is somewhat indicative of having a malicious group policy object pushed out as a mechanism for distributing and executing the malware. So anytime any device connected to the domain, active device on the domain, gets served the ransomware and then is locked up. So very concerning. But what was also very interesting is that LockerGoga at Hydro started doing a lot of additional things in addition to just encrypting files. So while LockerGoga executes and still removes itself from disk and launches the same per file child process for encryption, what was interesting about this is that the ransom note gets dropped then as encryption is taking place instead of the end. And then some interesting things start happening in terms of behavior. So for one, it encrypts everything outside of the local system directory on the host in question. So unless a file is locked by an active process, everything is going to get taken care of, whereas the earlier version wasn't quite as extensive in terms of targeting. But then we start seeing some really weird things in that local user and administrator passwords on the victim machine were changed. They were changed to a hard-coded value, so not too complex, but still, unless you're looking at the malware itself and reverse engineering it, which you're probably not doing as you're trying to respond to an entire network compromise, you're not going to know that information, at least not offhand. Then the system network card is disabled and all logged in users are forcibly logged off. So at this point, not only are files of the machine encrypted, but the machine itself has roughly been made inaccessible. Again, short of examining the malware and identifying the new password for local user and administrator accounts, those accounts are even on, remote logon is impossible. So what was curious about this is, you go through all this effort to deploy malware in this environment, do a whole of network compromise, and then at that very last step, you kind of make it hard in order to figure out what's going on and how to carry on from here. So at first it was, I have to say that Norsk has done an excellent job in transparency and highlighting how they've recovered from operations. Less information about how they were actually compromised or what actually took place, and things have sort of dripped out over time. So, it may be that, the samples that were initially, examined on VirusTotal, and they appeared to come from Norway, that appeared roughly the same time as this incident occurred. Like, well, maybe it's not the same variant that is used at Hydro. However, there was some reporting from the Wall Street Journal, and you can look at links to these items in the accompanying white paper to this presentation, where officials at the company essentially admitted that this was at least the type of behavior that they were seeing in their environment, because they emphasized that the ransomware, which they subsequently identified as the LockerGoga variant, performed password changes on devices, and that they were putting in defenses in order to try and detect or prevent this activity moving forward. So it certainly seems that this is the kind of activity in the samples involved that were relevant to the incident in question. And based on that, there were some initial justified suspicions on this. Privately at Dragos, we had some suspicions that we shared in our reporting. Publicly, the folks over at Talos and then others, just looking at how the malware behaved. Like, why would you make it harder for your victim to try and even contact you in the first place to negotiate to make a payment and other activity, which is very, very strange. Because when we're looking at how this functioned, we're talking about malware that was designed to be distributed essentially outside of working hours for the most part, or for encryption upon immediate connectivity to the domain. And dropping the ransom note at the very beginning, like, okay, like if you're interactively logged down and using the machine, yes, you can probably see it while weird things are occurring, but because this is happening overnight, which appears to have been the case for how LockerGoga and the Hydro incident function, really doesn't matter. So the ransom note's dropped. The local account password changes makes it difficult to try and log on locally, but then the network card disabling means you can't remotely log on, and Active Directory is also completely shot to hell at this point as well. So that kind of removes another avenue to try to access the machine. And then forcibly logging the user off makes any sort of system access very difficult. So you can try booting the system with a boot disk or something else along those lines in order to try and see what's going on. But again, really introducing a lot of friction or a lot of difficulty in even trying to view the ransom note to figure out what the hell is going on in the first place. So not impossible in order to figure out what's going on, but definitely making it more difficult than you would think would be wise or necessary if all you're trying to do is extort money from the organization in question. But the timing itself was also pretty weird. So the very day that the LockerGoga event happened, Hydro announced the appointment of a new CEO. Now, it's important to note that the appointment was not going to be effective until May of that year, but certainly that change in leadership had been announced, and then shortly thereafter, over the evening, you get this very widespread ransomware event occurring. So that was kind of strange. But you can look at this as potentially trying to time things at a point where corporate leadership and communication might be a little bit unsettled, and some other assumptions along those lines. So it's difficult to say with any sort of certainty why this matters, but it is interesting looking at how this took place in conjunction with the change in leadership and the appointment of a new CEO. So then, looking at the intrusion path, though, it also seemed that we had something a little bit different from how past events had taken place. So first, we had targeted phishing via a modified customer document. This came out in a couple of press reports where interviews with a Norsk Hydro personnel identified that a existing customer interaction or customer communication channel had been spied upon, compromised in some fashion, and what appears to be a document that was expected as part of that conversation was modified and made malicious in order to allow for initial access. Don't have a sample of that, unfortunately, and this is based off of some very limited details in media interviews, but coming from the employee personnel itself, it seems like that is the initial access vector, and several months in advance of the ransomware incident itself. Then we had the whole of Active Directory compromise. So whereas the Altron incident seemed to involve just credential capture and then pivoting through the environment with commercial tools and using PSExec, instead with the Hydro variant, we saw Active Directory compromised and then Active Directory leveraged in order to impact all domain joined machines. So still some superficial similarities with the other, at that point, the only other main known LockerGoga incident, but significant differences, especially when we start looking at the Active Directory particulars of how the event took place. Now, there was some reporting that took place less than a month or so after the Hydro incident that indicated a connection between LockerGoga and FIN6, that this actor was distributing Ryuk and LockerGoga ransomware in several unidentified incidents in the report. And so, well, maybe this was just part of a wider spread campaign by a known criminal actor, which would kind of tie things up a little bit, although there's still sort of weird things involved with how this ransomware functioned and was distributed. However, while it's certainly very possible that, and I'm not going to doubt or whatever that FIN6 was involved in some ransomware events, there are significant differences between what was described as FIN6 related activity and what happened within the Norsk Hydro environment. So for FIN6 associated events, the FireEye reporting emphasized brute force access to networks via external services, similar to what the French CERT had reported on for the Altron incident. And then the use of commercial public tools for lateral movement and PSExec and batch files to spread and execute the malware. So again, very similar to the French CERT report that came out a few weeks prior to the FireEye report. So it seems like those events are likely linked, or at least very similar in nature. Whereas Hedro, we saw that initial access took place via a significantly different method through compromised customer communications and a unidentified malicious document. Then moving on to an Active Directory compromise for distribution, and then some indeterminate mechanism we don't completely know, although reporting from the Norwegian CERT NSM, as well as some other hints in press interviews indicated it was likely Active Directory-based execution to deliver the malware. So, very plausible and probably quite likely that we have this FIN6 related activity associated with some distribution of other LockerGoga variants, as well as potentially Ryuk. But the Norsk Hedro event is substantially different in terms of methodology and exhibited behaviors, that the two don't appear to be linked or the result of an actor operating in the same mechanisms. What was also interesting, though, is that just after the Hedro incident, some reporting emerged about a couple of other companies that were hit with a LockerGoga as well. US-based chemical companies Hexion and Momentum, and this came out on the 22nd, 23rd of March. However, what was interesting about these events is that while they first came to light publicly after Norsk Hedro, examination showed that the compromises at these companies actually occurred before Hedro, about a week prior. So looking at these events, all available evidence about what happened at Hexion and Momentum, and unfortunately there's not that much out there except for some malware samples that appear linked in time with when these events occurred. But what little data exists all suggests that these were similar to the Altron event, and unlike the Norsk Hedro event. There's no evidence of having the additional disruptive capabilities associated with the LockerGoga variant that we saw at Hedro, the password changes and the forced logoff activity. Thus, subsequent analysis reveals that the events happened prior to Hedro, and thankfully, malware developers occasionally do things like versioning of their software. Even looking at the binaries themselves, we see that the samples in question that are most likely associated with everything are a version behind what was exhibited in the Hedro environment, and we'll see a table of that in a few slides here. So it looked like Hedro was kind of standing on its own as far as a LockerGoga event that had this weird additional functionality, but then some interesting things emerged in the press several months later, after many of us had already moved on from this event and just kind of written it off as ransomware. So some dogged reporting by the Wall Street Journal, a trade publication focusing on the metals industry, as well as reporting in Norwegian press, if you are a Norwegian speaker, indicated that there was something else going on, that there were additional potential or intended victims that were targeted by the same entity responsible for the Hedro event, but that Norwegian authorities and other potential victims were able to disrupt operations based on quick information sharing by officials at Norsk Hedro. So this was very interesting because we hadn't seen the disruptive LockerGoga variant anywhere else, and there's certainly no other public reporting or even looking at commercial or other malware repositories of any samples that don't, outside of things that are obvious researcher manipulation of things. It just seemed like Hedro was standing on its own. But then this reporting emerged that, well, there were ultimately other entities, many of which appear to be Norwegian entities, that were also targeted by the same disruptive variant of this malware roughly at the same time. And it was only through quick action and information sharing by Hedro personnel that this was averted. So that leads to some questions, like, was this a coordinated event? So it's unclear what other entities may have been targeted by this disruptive variant. The reporting is a little ambiguous whether these were, it indicates that other European entities, but an emphasis on Norway, that were these entities in other countries? Were these entities potentially headquartered elsewhere, but with operations in Norway? Because if this was really something focused geographically or economically on the Norwegian economy, this could be very significant very quickly by crippling multiple major economic entities at roughly the same time. Now we're talking about moving on from a very disruptive ransomware event to something that could potentially harm an economy for weeks or months at a time as part of the recovery effort. And then LockerGoga disappeared. While there are some indications that you'll see reporting of other security vendors saying that they've responded to other events with LockerGoga, it's very interesting in that there's been no public information available of any other ransomware incident tied to LockerGoga since Norsk. There's one incident where if we start looking, well, there's one incident that we'll talk about in a second that may be related, but then the malware just seemed to drop off the face of the earth. Because we see that there was a fairly regular development life cycle for this malware, just looking at samples that are available, starting in early January of 2019, then moving through a fairly robust development period in January and February. But what's interesting is that all of these samples pretty much do the same thing. You see changes in the ransomware email addresses and some other items, but otherwise, things remain fairly constant with just sort of changes around the edges, so to speak, until 18th March for the Norsk incident. We see version 1.5.1, which adds on that additional disruptive functionality. And then, at least in every repository that I have access to, I've not observed any other samples of LockerGoga with a higher version number since then. So again, maybe they exist out there, but not in anything that I've been able to find. So looking at this from a timeline perspective, so we first see, in early January, the first LockerGoga samples start hitting in the wild or whatever, showing up in places like VirusTotal, et cetera. And then in late January, we had the Altron event. Then nothing really happens for a little bit, at least nothing that was publicly acknowledged or available. Then 9 to 12 March, we have the Hexion and Momentum events just before the Norsk incident, but using a variant of LockerGoga that was encrypt only, that didn't have the additional account changes and network disabling functionality. Then on 19 March, the Norsk event, and then really nothing. There was one possible event, a Swiss manufacturer, AB Schmidt, that may have been related to LockerGoga, but there's indeterminate information. It came up as one possibility that for what sample or what family might be involved, but essentially LockerGoga disappears. So really, this starts getting very strange very quickly because, as we saw earlier, while ransomware certainly is, very active in development, and we see lots and lots of different samples popping up over time. At the same time, just from a monetization standpoint, if you have something that works, you typically don't get rid of it right away. So why would you stop using something that seems to be effective? And, as we've seen with several high-profile incidents, it seemed to be fairly effective. But also, there's still that nagging point of, why would you make negotiation for decryption arbitrarily difficult for the victim, as was the case in the Hedro environment, and doing so potentially against multiple other entities at the same time? It just starts seeming very, very strange why this particular sample, with possibly other linked events that were disrupted, would be so malicious, for lack of a better description, and while also at the same time difficult to respond to. Well, to take a little bit of a diversion, we could look at ransomware as a wiper functionality. So this isn't something unheard of. We saw this already with NotPetya back in 2017 and detailed in a lot of reporting by Andy Greenberg, among others, as far as how that event played out. So, initially targeting in Ukraine and then spreading like wildfire around the world, impacting entities from Maersk to Mondelez to all sorts of other entities that had suffered significant damage as a result of this event. But what was interesting about NotPetya is that it was pretty damn obvious for anyone who was paying attention to how it functioned that it was not ransomware. While it took the Petya ransomware family as sort of its baseline for functionality in affecting the master boot record and the master file tables of the victims in question to really achieve whole of system disruption, just the way in which it functioned and generated a victim ID, which would be required for decrypting the box in question, it was just a random number that was thrown out there. So there was no way to really link back any single incident to allow for matching with a decryption key. And as Matt Suchet and researchers at Kaspersky pointed out, it's not ransomware, it's essentially a wiper, encrypting machines and essentially throwing away the key. But then, while there were suspicions around this at the time, then multiple governments in the summer of 2017 came right out and said that, hey, not only was NotPetya a wiper and not ransomware, this was also state-directed activity largely focused on Ukraine, but spreading to the United States, Europe, and elsewhere instead. So now we're starting to see NotPetya repurposed ransomware as a wiper becoming part of the arsenal of disruptive cyber activity linked to state interests. So what was interesting about this, though, is that if you look at how NotPetya functioned, uh, if we're assuming that Russia was involved, and all evidence seems to indicate that this was a Russian state-sponsored activity, uh, the Russians kind of shot themselves in the foot on this one. So NotPetya, in addition to hitting, having substantial impacts in Ukraine, it spread maybe a little too well because it impacted entities like Rosneft and Russian financial institutions and other entities, not as significantly as we saw in Ukraine or with a Maersk event, but still producing damage in Russia. So this would certainly seem to be something that, while it was very effective, it might have been almost too effective considering how widely it spread and where some of the damage ended up. So if we look at NotPetya, we can see that it's having some failures. Even though it was wildly successful as a mass disruption tool, it probably was doing so against the wishes or desires of its controllers, because it seemed to spread too far and produce collateral damage. It's also interesting, while we look at NotPetya as being a global event, given the ME-DOC compromise that was used as the initial infection vector in order to deliver it, so a malicious update to accounting software used only in Ukraine, the fact that it spread not just to Russia, so collateral self-damage or whatever, but also to NATO members in the United States, probably was unintentional, because that starts producing, or at least going down a route of extended disruption that might result in some level of retaliation. In this case, we only had name and shame, because it seems that that's all we do these days. But at the same time, that seems reckless. So there was that aspect. But it's also the question that NotPetya wasn't even really a credible ransomware example. Fairly quick technical analysis by a few researchers was able to show that, nope, this is not remotely tenable as an idea as a ransomware operation like WannaCry was, or something else along those lines, that it was unmasked and state-directed fairly quickly by both the security community and then subsequent impacted governments. But what if we revised NotPetya? So instead of having a encryption mechanism that essentially does not allow for decryption, that we use something that is quite plausible. The possibility of recovery exists, and it maps to known authentic ransomware behavior. Then we tighten our targeting aperture a little bit with a more focused spreading mechanism. So instead of something that's wormable and that we lose control over, spread through a mechanism that allows for control over how this malware is being put out there and what victims are in place. So rather than something that propagates on its own or through supply chain targeting that doesn't allow for selectivity in victims, use something like deliberate interactive operations against a target and then spread widely only within that target environment to eliminate possible collateral damage. And finally, to evade attribution, start blending in better with ransomware activity by using a family that is still active. It's interesting that NotPetya emerged after the Petya variant had been dormant for several months at that point in time. But also, just blending in with overall ransomware activity to sort of avoid the potential for repercussions, responses. I mean, it is noteworthy that with NotPetya, while, I say name and shame, that's all we do, there were also sanctions applied as a result. So there were, we can laugh them out. That's just more sanctions, who cares? But that still produces some economic cost on the part of the likely perpetrators of the event, and something that, all things being equal, you would probably like to avoid. So revising NotPetya in this way starts putting us into the territory of more focused ransomware-like activity, where we legitimately encrypt a system in question, but short of either getting very lucky on a decryption key, that if you're using standard encryption algorithms, that essentially if you have no intention of ever decrypting it, you've done the same thing of locking devices while never intending to reveal the key. So looking at ransomware as a potential cyber weapon, we can take a ransomware variant and modify something with strong encryption to add additional disruptive impacts, like we saw at Norsk with the forced system logoff, preventing at least easy system access across thousands of workstations simultaneously. You can start having real disruption on victim networks, so long as you're also deploying in a focused way so that you're avoiding overspread or collateral damage as a result, and ultimately with the intention of never disclosing the key or even responding to ransom negotiation to perpetuate that disruption. So now we've developed and deployed a mechanism to disrupt and subvert networks on a large scale, but in a focused way that also blends in quite nicely with known criminal activity. And assuming that the victim organization in question wasn't intending to pay in the first place, which certainly many organizations claim this. Who actually follows that is up for debate. But in the case of Hydro, it's pretty clear, and I think Norwegian government guidance is pretty strict on this as well, that no negotiations, no payment, that if you're pretty confident that the organization is going to try to recover, playing this or following this playbook becomes fairly effective to induce a disruptive impact while masquerading as criminal activity. So what's the benefits of this? Well, you get plausible deniability. It's very easy to try and blend in with general criminal activity instead of waving the obvious flag of, hey, I'm state-sponsored disruption capability, as was the case with NotPetya. And you get effective disruption as a result. The widespread encryption that took place within the NotPetya, or not the NotPetya, within the Norsk Hydro LockerGoga variant, between the system disruption through the account changes and network card disabling, as well as encrypting pretty much everything outside of the system folder, means that you have a fairly degraded environment that you're operating in, but all of this blends in to recognize criminal behavior. The tools in question can be available for purchase on dark web or black criminal underground markets for potential modification. So you already have software out there that with a few tweaks, like adding again those disruptive components to them or requesting them from developers, you can get those, and thus there's no need to disclose sensitive capabilities like a 0-day or some custom malware toolkit. So lots of things that start making this look like a pretty economical way of launching a disruptive attack against a organization, including one as large and what seems to be a fairly well-defended organization. Everything I've read about Norsk Hydro's operations indicated that this was not a sort of easy target or whatever in question. They seem to have had a pretty robust security program and just were methodically compromised and then hit with this rather nasty ransomware-like event. But then there's some other interesting aspects as well, because one of the things that makes this case still somewhat curious is that there are impacts on reporting and sharing as a result of how we treat different classes of activity and some of the repercussions that come with widespread disruptive incidents, especially when we start talking about commercial entities and not things like local governments. Because looking at the conflict between restoration and investigation, we start seeing different incentives involved. So commercial entities, and especially victims, really focused on trying to get back up and running as soon as they can. The possibility of state-sponsored activity, however, within an environment starts prioritizing evidence collection and analysis over immediate recovery, because you don't want to step on, delete, or otherwise get rid of evidence in the course of trying to restore the network. So if you invite the FBI or some other entity or whatever to start going through your network or whatever, you're probably going to limit how quickly you can also respond. And if you have such a widespread event, that may result in a less than ideal ability to try and get up and running as quickly as possible. So you can start impeding restoration and recovery, but also you start getting into really troublesome areas as far as data sharing is concerned, because while you have governments or other entities that might want to distribute information to try and get ahead of the potential security risk, like we want to make sure that we're sharing IOCs, what happened in this environment so other potential victims can respond. And it looks like that was somewhat the case within the Hydro event, where through quiet sharing with Norwegian authorities, they were able to disrupt additional activity. At the same time, there's reputational and other risks involved in sharing information because leaks do happen. People talk to the press and other items. Like this entire presentation is based solely on publicly available information, and there's an awful lot that you can gather once you start piecing together lots of different sources that maybe fell off from some of the initial reporting from March of 2019. So now we start getting the possibility of both reputational risks, but also something interesting that's emerged, especially in an era of cyber insurance that NotPetya really highlights fairly well. Because these events, whether ransomware or otherwise, are very costly. They cost organizations millions of dollars, potentially billions of dollars in the case of some of the NotPetya impacts. And so you see organizations that have taken out insurance policies that extend to cyber impacts, relying on these insurance policies to try and make up those losses. Yet what's interesting is that in the case of NotPetya, once it was revealed that that attack was a state-directed activity, then active war clauses within those policies started to be invoked and insurance claims denied. This is still being worked out in court, so this might work out a little bit differently. But now we have a perverse incentive that if we start investigating a disruptive ransomware event and maybe find evidence that it's not actually criminal activity, but could be something more, am I then opening my organization up to the possibility of significant financial loss because now I'm opening it up for lawyers and insurance adjusters to look at the situation and highlight certain clauses that then would negate a potential payout? So lots of worrying things. We have this sort of interesting playbook of how to weaponize criminal software in order to make it into, essentially low-cost, deniable cyber weapons. But there are some limitations to this mechanism. For one thing, a attack is really only as useful as you can advertise that someone has been attacked. If you're trying, from a state policy standpoint, having something that is too deniable almost defeats the purpose, because you may fail in being able to message to your victims that you were trying to punish them, deter them, or some other sort of action in the first place because something appears criminal in nature. So you start divorcing action from political purposes and geopolitical goals, which kind of defeats the purpose of doing any of this in the first place. But ultimately, while these are concerns, at the same time, if all you care about is inflicting pain on someone, you still have quite a bit of flexibility in terms of leveraging this mechanism for bad purposes. So what do we do from a defense and detection standpoint? Well, if we have entities that are willing to, take something from, the NotPetya playbook and revise it to reflect something more like the Norsk incident as a, possible state-directed activity masquerading as ransomware, the thing is that standard ransomware defense still applies. Things such as offline backups, ensuring that you are limiting the possibility of lateral movement within your network, hardening Active Directory, etc. All those still come into play. The fairly standard security items all come into question, or are applicable in this instance. But the other thing is that when we start talking about cases that get a little bit murkier, where we're uncertain on intentions and things aren't clear cut between, is this something that's meant to monetize or something that's meant to purely disrupt, we need to try to identify mechanisms to facilitate information sharing in a way that victims and related organizations don't have to fear for potential financial loss or reputational risk or getting beaten in the press or whatever over events, to make sure that we can get ahead of these things and actually disposition them appropriately. So another interesting aspect of this too is that ransomware has been incredibly prolific, and even right now in the current global situation with the novel coronavirus variant, pleading with ransomware developers to please not attack hospitals. Well, one of the reasons is that we've done a really shit job from a security standpoint and a policy standpoint of actually going after these entities. It doesn't help that many of these criminal gangs and whatnot almost certainly operate in permissive environments where with a few bribes to local law enforcement, you can do whatever you want so long as it doesn't impact people back home. But we really need to start getting serious about this problem and sort of clean up that criminal market to sort of reduce the scope for state-sponsored entities to then come in and mimic this activity as well. So sort of two tracks there. One, ransomware sucks and we need to get rid of it as best we can. So actually following through and trying to find these people, arrest them, or whatever makes sense or that's possible, is valuable in and of itself. But then in combination with that, by cleaning up this activity, we can then take away the possibility of other entities leveraging similar techniques for purely disruptive purposes like the hypotheticals described in this presentation. So lots of references on this. These slides will be available, I think, on SlideShare afterwards. Linda can probably answer that question better than I am. This presentation has been recorded and will be available on the Dragos website later. But also, if you really want to dive into this in detail, because this is just an overview of a lot of work, this is all written up in a fairly lengthy white paper, which is available at this address. So if this was interesting, or it's like, I wasn't sure about what he was saying there or where that's coming from, a very meticulously sourced paper is available on this subject for anyone that wants to dive in deeper or look at where some of this information is coming from. So with that, I took about exactly as much time as I intended. So we have some time for questions if anyone is curious or wants to point out where I may have gotten something wrong.
Thank you, Joe. That was terrific. Really interesting. We do have some questions that have come in. First question, is there a LockerGoga link to NotPetya?
There is not, as far as I can tell, there is not a LockerGoga link to NotPetya. And that's why presenting this in this rather short format might make that confusing. So really the only link that that exists is just a notional one of looking at NotPetya as being ransomware that was redesigned and repurposed for a purely disruptive effect. That if you were to try and improve on that model so that you avoid the collateral damage and have a more plausible encryption mechanism, what would that look like? And at least the hypothesis I'm putting out is that it would look a lot like what happened at Norsk. That doesn't mean that the two are directly linked, but rather it just shows how a methodology can change over time. So apologies for any confusion there.
Thanks. Next question. Was the payment of ransomware made difficult as well?
So that we don't know. At least based on any what public information exists, it looks like Altron did not pay. So we don't know exactly from that incident with the more pure ransomware version of LockerGoga. And then Norsk was very adamant that they were not going to pay one way or the other. Although, again, it's an open question given how the ransom note was delivered. Like, yeah, you could eventually recover it some way. But, first there was that difficulty. And then because the organization and, maybe this is something that we would expect given a sort of Nordic sensibility or whatever of not following the, criminal demands here or whatever, maybe there was some expectation that they knew that they would never pay. It is interesting that there are rumors, who don't know for sure because the evidence has not come out one way or the other, that Hexion and Momentive might have paid, but that also applies to a different version of LockerGoga that follows the less disruptive path without the account changes and other items. So, ultimately, I guess the short answer, instead of lots of other details around this, is we don't know because there's no indication whatsoever that anyone tried to reach out to, I think it was Wyatt Pettigrew at Proton Mail or whatever the other email address was in the Norsk specific LockerGoga variant ransom note.
Okay, fair enough. Is it fair to call LockerGoga a cyber weapon, considering its ability to cripple operations?
See, and this is where it's tough because, and I've tried emphasizing, very painfully trying to make this distinction in the paper, and it always makes for a very nuanced argument, but a hard one to put very succinctly, is that the LockerGoga variant that was present at Norsk, in my professional opinion, based on an analysis of all available evidence, that it is indeterminate that it was a cyber weapon, but the possibility exists based upon the odd functionality and how it relates to the LockerGoga development lifecycle prior to that incident. So I can't say that, yes, this was a state-sponsored event or whatever, and the Norwegians were getting attacked by some, undisclosed entity. But there's enough fuzziness around this that it's very curious. And then looking at the event itself, that, myself not being a very smart person, there are other far smarter people out there who have probably looked at this incident and figured out that, hey, this is a really interesting way to try and execute something while also blending in with a lot of other background noise to avoid possible identification and repercussions.
Next question. Is there any evidence of any retaliation to the Norsk incident?
So there is reporting, and I've spoken to some people in law enforcement, mostly in Europe, that there seem to be some efforts to try to really track this down, but I've not heard of any success thus far. I wouldn't expect to hear of any success. I would expect people to keep that rather quiet until they've been able to make a case for obvious reasons. So there's certainly some efforts along those lines, but we're a year later at this point, and so far no results, unfortunately. So there's certainly a desire to try to figure out who did this and hold them responsible, but it doesn't seem like there's been any success on that to date.
Okay. Can enterprises like Norsk count on defending themselves on their own? Don't events like this call for a coalition of states willing to raise the price for this type of activity?
Potentially. And this is one of the closing points I was trying to make, is that, however we want to look at this event, like, this was a very disruptive event, whether it was criminal, state-sponsored, eco-terrorists, who knows? Whoever took LockerGoga and made it even nastier than it was previously really inflicted a lot of pain. And unfortunately, we've been really bad at trying to hold the people that do this sort of activity accountable in any fashion, whether that's criminal or otherwise. And we need to start getting serious about that, because ransomware, even just as a purely criminal enterprise, is a very bad and nasty thing. Moving on from that, I mean, I think we're starting to see some of this already with greater coordination and cooperation among the certs, among organizations themselves, and trying to get at data sharing. But we also have to make sure that, and this goes back to one of the things with the NotPetya incident, that if we have events that produce damage or disruption that inflict a monetary cost, that we're not providing a perverse incentive to organizations to not share information because they're worried about lawsuits, insurance claims denied, or other items based on who that attack or what that event might be linked back to. So clearing that up in some way, I think, is going to really help in the future as we get entities that take advantage of murkiness around certain sort of attack vectors in order to execute things in ways that can be deniable, but then where investigation might result in costs, even further costs for the victims in question.
Thanks, Joe. A few more questions are coming in, and we appreciate these questions from the attendees. Does Dragos have a stance on whether to pay ransom?
I don't know if Dragos does, to be honest with you. I'm sure if I called up Rob Lee right now or whatever, he would definitely have a stance. My personal stance is that we should not be incentivizing this activity. However, that's my professional opinion. There was an interesting blog post put out, I believe by Kelly Shortridge, a couple of months ago, though, that has a different take about trying to keep ransomware activity kind of at a low boil if we can't actually get rid of it because we're unable or unwilling to pursue appropriate legal mechanisms to sort of destroy this activity. That maybe paying the ransom isn't a bad idea in certain cases, as long as you can keep things at a certain agreeable level of minimized disruption. It's a very interesting argument, and I can try and post it somewhere. I don't know if I have the ability to do that right now, but there are cogent arguments in the other way. Personally, though, I think that the same way why paying ransom for kidnapping just incentivizes more kidnappers, it seems like that's the case here. That if this activity wasn't paying off, we wouldn't see as much of it going on.
Okay. Any details on the recent attack on natural gas compression facility?
I'm trying to remember, Linda, did we publish a blog on that?
Eakins, maybe?
No, that was a different one.
Oh.
So this was, I believe this is referring to the, it was first disclosed by the U.S. Coast Guard in not a notice to mariners, but a security bulletin about a Ryuk ransomware event at a natural gas related compressor station or something similar. And then there was follow-on reporting from DHS CISA a couple of months later that didn't expressly link to that event at the time, then had a couple of additional details. Really, I believe we did publish some information in a blog post emphasizing that it was the same event, and we're starting to see greater focus, greater emphasis on targeting industrial and critical infrastructure related entities, whether that's a natural gas facility to your local government and the school system, which is very concerning because we're starting to see bad actors shrug off the risk that comes in disrupting these activities. Like, for example, with that natural gas facility, they shut down for about 2 days because they couldn't verify, good on them that they shut down and lost production because they couldn't guarantee the safety and integrity of the environment after it was compromised, but they still shut down for a couple of days, which is very costly. And, in this incident, it didn't really result in any follow-on impacts, but if you're talking about something along the lines of a more widespread gas impact, such as a major pipeline or something, now you're talking about an incident that, yes, that organization's feet are held to the fire, but also every chemical plant and every natural gas power plant that's feeding off that pipeline is also at risk because they can't get feedstock in order to operate. So, the main thing I would say to add on from that event, and thank you, Linda, for providing a link to that blog post in the chat. The main thing from that incident is that it just seems that ransomware authors are getting more risk tolerant or just don't care about what the follow-on actions to their behavior might be. And, we can see this as well in going after hospitals or other organizations that, this activity is just really bad and needs to stop, and need to figure out how to make that happen soon because it's starting to get ridiculous and, quite frankly, a little dangerous.
Definitely. Do you believe there's currently significant visibility gap in threat analysis in terms of wiper incidents being concealed as ransomware as in this case, or do you think it's a rather rare occurrence?
I think it's not a common occurrence, but I think the visibility question definitely comes into play. That in a lot of instances, I don't think the reason why I've been digging into this for a year or whatever is that it just seems so curious and strange. And digging in, like the data is just not there to disposition it authoritatively, and so it's creating that sort of space where someone could sneak in as a malicious non-criminal entity to do something quite nasty. So yeah, I don't think that this is a common occurrence, but I do think that we have unintentionally allowed for the space exists that entities can take advantage of this if they so desired.
Okay. Would encryption methodology be blocked with strong application control or whitelisting, or was that something that may have had been defeated?
So I don't know that specifically about the Hedro environment. I mean, it's, if you're doing strong application whitelisting, like, yeah, the ransomware is never going to execute. So that's a great idea, if you can do that without also really pissing off your entire user base and resulting in some other impacts to the business. So, things like application whitelisting, if you can do it, awesome. And that stops a lot of these things sort of in their tracks. One thing that we didn't get into in the presentation, but that came up as an interesting observation with LockerGoga when it first appeared, is that all LockerGoga variants, well, almost all, I think there's a couple of exceptions, are signed. So they're code signed with a Sectigo certificate. And code signing checks, that's one item that's offered as like, well, you can't do application whitelisting. Well, maybe just don't allow unsigned binaries to execute. That is a little bit more flexible. Well, the problem with that is it's not that hard, unfortunately, to get a code signing cert from certain providers. And LockerGoga is not exclusive in this. That there are other, if you follow like Vitaly Kremenez on Twitter or Malware Hunt Team, you see other examples of signed malware that exist out in the wild. So, there's how should I say this or whatever? There are options, but at the same time, it's one of those things that, figuring out what's going on, or, what sort of defensive measures can be put into place and what limitations also exist as a result makes it for a fine balancing act between the two.
Do you have any theories about the purpose of the disruptive attack at Norsk Hydro?
I mean, if we wanted to like sit around or whatever with a couple of beverages and just spitball things, I can come up with ideas. But at the same time, doing that publicly is a little bit irresponsible because honestly, we don't know. I mean, I could theorize a bunch of things or whatever about why someone might have executed a disruptive attack masquerading as ransomware against a major Norwegian manufacturer. But, all of that would just be conjecture. So I'm just not going to go down that route because, if nothing else, one of the things in even doing this is that a lot of what Norsk Hydro did in this event was really good. They, were very transparent in their response process. They seemed like they had a really good security program in place prior to this incident occurring, and just people get compromised. So I don't want to make this into potential victim shaming or cause them more problems. It's just unfortunate for them that they happen to be the victims of what seemed like a really interesting fuzzy case to me that served as sort of a blueprint for other potential activity.
Okay, we have one more question and we're coming up on the hour. That last question that we're going to take is, can you elaborate on the comment about other Norwegian companies maybe being targeted right after the event at Norsk Hydro?
Yes, and unfortunately I can't elaborate much because these were just a couple of mentions. There was the one Wall Street Journal article from Catherine Schupp, August of 2019, and then a couple of items in Aftenposten and another Norwegian item. I can't recall the publication name right now. They're both linked in the white paper, and I think they're in the references section of the slide deck as well. That really just sort of indicated at a high level that other organizations were targeted as well, but no further information. I've tried asking about that, and as one would expect, it haven't really gotten any answers. So that's something that I'd be very curious to learn more about as well. And unfortunately, more detailed public information just isn't available at this time.
That's all the questions. Thank you for answering them, Joe. And thank you for this great presentation.
Yep.
Thanks to everybody for joining us today. As Joe mentioned, we will post a recording of the slides and send them to you, and they'll be available on our website. Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Thanks, everyone.